I'm going to start us off with the land acknowledgement. And I just want to acknowledge that we're here in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, particularly the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So let us always remember that we are guests here on the lands of these nations and pray and work for the day in which we might be together in right relationship. And I know many of you are on the lands of other nations, so feel free to now to post those nation names in the chat. And welcome to this fifth get together of Harold Rosen's Justice series. Today we're going to be looking at Western views of justice. So we're very excited to learn together, and I'm going to turn it over to Harold now.
Okay, friends, thank you. A little bit of a reorientation. You know, we're 2 weeks apart at least, so it's nice to do a little bit of a reorientation. So we're looking at material that might be more familiar to most of us because we've had sort of a Western, sometimes Christian influenced education. And however, there's a piece of Western uh, uh, influence on justice that is Eastern. In other words, Christianity has an Eastern side, an Eastern branch, so to speak. So we're going to bring that into the picture. We're looking, at things that humanity has learned from Israel, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, which is that large area around Constantinople, or what's called today Istanbul, Turkey, Asia Minor, that part of the world, Eastern Mediterranean, and Europe. And the next session, we're looking specifically at something called international law. When did those notions arise? And so again, we'll be looking at some of the same material, but getting a little bit closer to today. So next time we'll look at the Magna Carta in 1215 and jump to the 1600s and look at the last 4 centuries in terms of how the world has thought about international law and justice. Okay, but today we're picking up on the Western perspective, the contributions that have come from those parts of the world I mentioned. And I want to mention two other things that way back in the beginning, I sent you something called the Justice Series Slides. So that was a slideshow. And I think some of you were sent that again. I just want to tell you the reason I think it's worth, looking at that different times. So as we go through this course, I think those slides will mean more and more. We did it as a quick overview, 25 slides that sort of cover the whole range of the course were given. And I think that those slides will mean more and more as you reflect on some of the main points of each of the sessions. I also sent something a long time ago, and I think I could send it again, either through Rachel or directly to you. It's called the Justice Course Outline. Justice Course Outline. See, that was 4 pages. And those 4 pages gave a substantive outline of the 8 sessions. So, for example, each of the 8 sessions have about 10 pieces in them. And it reminds you what those 10 pieces are. I know that different minds work in different ways. Tables of contents are really important to me. Because this is a hint about what the person who wrote the book was thinking about. How did they structure it? And so I'm hoping that these pieces of each sessions will mean more and more as you reflect on them and look back. So the slideshow and the outline, I think, are ways of reminding yourself of the whole scope of what we're trying to do. Okay. First session, we looked at basic concepts and the timeline, key terms, the purposes, the sources for looking at justice and law in a global perspective. In the second session, we looked at some indigenous concepts, as you recall, including major civilizations like the Maya and the Inca and the Iroquois Confederacy in North America. And the third session, we bit off way more than can be chewed because we were looking at India and China and a few other things even. And then the fourth session, we looked at ancient Persia and the Zoroastrian tradition, along with the Islamic tradition. So today we turn to the West, which in a way should be. I've been mentioning Eurocentrism. I find that Eurocentrism even shows up when we look at Western history, because the Christian church is part of Western history, but the Christian church itself had an Eastern and a Western branch. And out of the Western branch came Protestant movement, of course, in the
Mhm.
16th century or the 1500s. But I find that people don't give enough respect to the eastern part of Christianity. So I'm going to mention a little bit of that here as we go through. The very first part of the first page of the handout for today, gives you like a sneak preview of coming attractions. I always think people need to kind of look at the basic area. So we're looking at Noah and Abraham and Moses, and then we go over to Greece and look at Solon and Cleisthenes. Then we turn to Rome, pick up on a few things in Rome, like those 12 tables. We look at Plato and Aristotle's view of justice because it was foundational to later philosophers and theologians in three traditions: Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. Um, Cosmopolitanism is extremely important. I think it's something that went under the radar because the most high-minded people in the Greco-Roman civilization had a cosmopolitan outlook. So, and it really affects it provides a foundation for what we could call international law. So I'll try to show you that, and that's like a preview of the next session. We'll look at session 6, which is the rise of international law. Then we look at a few things Jesus said, and Paul and Peter, and the Christian concept, contribution to looking at justice. We look at the key figure, Justinian, who was in the Eastern Christian tradition or Eastern Christendom, Constantinople. He generated a law code that ended up going around the world and was foundational for everything that happened in the West and a few other places. And it wasn't replaced very thoroughly until Napoleon's Code, about 13 centuries later. Okay, we also mentioned this figure, Vladimir of Kiev, because he's the one who, in a sense, declared that Russia would develop as a Christian empire. That's kind of significant. We'll look at Maimonides. He was a great Jewish thinker during the early medieval times, and his codification of Jewish law had some influence on the way others thought about law. Thomas Aquinas, another great thinker, spoke about natural law and divine law as pretty much working together. And that's an amazing concept. And so Thomas Aquinas gets a little more credit for the rise of science, looking for law in nature, as well as law that comes from divine sources that guides the development of human society. And Erasmus, another figure, right about the time, right before the Protestant Reformation, had a lot of influence and had some things to say that were important in terms of looking at justice more globally. Okay, and I skipped over the Magna Carta. So on that little timeline, you should put 1215, and it should say Magna Carta there. And we'll only mention it a little bit today, but look at it again in some more detail next time, because the Magna Carta is important in the Western concept of the idea of sovereigns being subject to law, sovereigns subject to law, not exempt from the law, not above the law. All right, so that was a key thing. We'll mention it again a little bit today, later, and then look at it in far more detail 2 weeks from now. The first big section, I'm going to try to get through some comments on Jewish contributions to law and justice in our Western mind, and Greek, and then stop and ask for comments and questions and observations and your own pieces of knowledge. Then we'll look at Christian concepts, East and West, in the latter part of today. But in general, I want to point something out. When we say something like Western civilization, that has layers. There's a Jewish layer to that. There's obviously a Greco-Roman layer to that. There's a Christian East and West layer to that. Okay, so all those are a part of the layers of like a Western worldview. And the word Eastern is still attached to Christianity. And so I'm going to try to bring that to people's attention. Um, okay, so again, I'm not going to touch on everything I put in the handout, just remind people of things. So the Jewish concept of law is this idea of righteousness before God or observance of divine law. And of course, that's been associated with a series of prophets, Adam, Noah, Abraham, and especially Moses. Moses revealed what's called the Hebrew Scriptures, and we wouldn't know about those earlier prophets if Moses hadn't told us about them. So the first 5 books of the Bible is called the Law of Moses, and it also contains these stories of earlier traditions. So in other words, what's called Judaism is like a report, you might say, on previous traditions that Moses told us about and then added a lot to. Okay, so I mentioned that at the bottom of page 1. On page 2, I have some highlights of Jewish civilization broadly. I just want to alight on 2 of these things that I list here, top of page 2. Moses' liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, delivering the law, capital L, at Sinai, training a chosen people in covenantal dynamics and reaching the promised land. So that's a way of summarizing the mission of Moses, in one full sentence. And that includes the 10 Commandments, of course, and the basis for the other 613 laws that you find, in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, also Solomon is here, and I think this is underappreciated. I put under Solomon's expansion of the kingdom. So, the United Monarchy was very influential. It was a superpower of the day. I don't know if people realize that. So Jerusalem was the center of a much larger piece of real estate than we realize it, including, it influenced Egypt. It influenced other parts of the Middle East. So Solomon's expansion of the kingdom, building the temple, developing a powerful wisdom tradition. I'm someday going to try to teach a course on Solomon's wisdom tradition because it's much bigger than people realize. Yeah, the Solomon's Wisdom School got set up in various cities like Damascus and Jerusalem and Antioch and influenced Greek civilization to a large degree. And it had implications for law. Wisdom meant essentially realizing the power of divine law. Wisdom is observing the law. Wisdom is fear of violating the divine law. So a lot of that came through Solomon, who also generated interest in what we would later call the sciences, the way that there's natural law in all of creation put there by God, and we can discover it. That's part of what wisdom entails as well. Okay, I'm jumping to something called Noah's Code. That's in the middle of page 2, the Noah's Code and the Rainbow Covenant. I didn't know this until maybe 15 years ago, that there was something called Noah's Code. This has slipped under the radar. The way we know about it is from oral tradition, Jewish oral tradition. Noah's Code is not there in the Bible, but I've put here 7 points, 7 laws. And one law is to establish law courts, establish justice courts. That was part of what Noah said humanity should do. Number 2, a prohibition against idolatry. Number 3, a prohibition against blasphemy. Number 4, a prohibition against murder. Number 5, a prohibition against adultery. Number 6, a prohibition against robbery. And 7, a prohibition against eating flesh cut from a living animal, which you might say is an early version of animal rights. Make sure the animal is dead before you start eating it. Wow. Okay. Hard for us to grasp that. But did you notice did that sound familiar? Some of those pieces of Noah's Code? You see, that's like a dress rehearsal for Moses's 10 Commandments that came later. So things have everything is developmental. It's good to see what came before. And so this Noah's Code is very, very important. And it's part of Jewish oral tradition. That's how we know about it. And what Jewish scholars would say, if you asked about Noah's Code, is they would say this is not only for Jews. This was directed to all of humanity. That's what Noah had in mind. All of humanity, as it develops, should at least have these 7 things. Okay, so that's an early law code, way, way back there. We don't know exactly how far back, about 5,000 years ago. Was there a world flood? I doubt if it was a world flood, but there were floods. And so the story of the flood, has some historical basis, regional floods around the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, I'm jumping now to Abraham, and we associate Abraham with monotheistic civilization. I think the biggest piece of the Abraham's heritage, though, has to do with his 3 wives. Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. Many people miss Keturah. She's mentioned in Genesis 25. And those 3 traditions are responsible for 5 religious civilizations. So in other words, through Sarah came Judaism and Christianity, through Hagar came Islam, and through Keturah came Zoroastrianism and the Baha'i faith. And some people say that Keturah and Abraham had 6 sons who went east. And that doesn't say much about them in the Bible. But if you look up oral traditions that are both Jewish and Islamic too, as well, Keturah is commented upon in those 2 oral traditions. It says those 6 sons went to what we would today call, Persia and even India. So Keturah's tradition may have some influence on how Hinduism and Buddhism developed. So the story of Abraham is a story of blessing all nations with monotheistic ideas, that one God is above all, and all law ultimately comes from God. And a lot of religions got a piece of the Abrahamic tradition. So that's how I see Abraham's, it was like a blessing to all of humanity. The words are that Abraham's family would be a blessing. All nations of the earth shall bless themselves through Abraham's tradition, right? That's the biblical pronouncement. I think that's very symbolic of humanity's cultures and civilizations having family resemblances and common sources. So the family of Abraham is, you might say, includes everybody. Okay, and then moving to Moses, this term halakha means law or righteousness before God, observance of divine covenants. I briefly summarize the story or mission of Moses, mentioning the 10 Commandments. No other gods, no graven images, no taking the Lord's name in vain, observing the Sabbath, honoring parents, no killing, no adultery, no stealing, no false witness. And then the 10th one, talking about don't even covet your neighbor's goods. That's a more psychological, spiritual type of commandment. Try not to be competitive with your neighbor in a materialistic sense. Okay, so those 10 commandments are more elaborate than Noah's code, right? And that had provided a foundation for the development of many Western concepts of law. All right, I want to tell you why I gave you Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy, here's a line from Deuteronomy 32. When the Most High, which means God, when the Most High separated the sons of men, he fixed the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. There's a typo. That should be a capital G, God there. Sons of capital G, God. Sorry about that. He, that is God, kept the children of Israel as the apple of his eye, the apple of his eye. But you, he's talking now to these children of Israel, but you forgot the God who gave you birth, yet the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone. The reason I'm including this is this concept of sons of God is mentioned way back in Deuteronomy, and I interpret this to mean major prophets, capital P prophets. So it's basically saying God is looking down and make sure there's at least one son of God in all the various regions of the world. And then God notices that you follow that for a while and then you don't, and then you get morally and spiritually weak, and then he sends another one of those. So I believe this is an early concept of what could be called progressive revelation right there in the book of Deuteronomy, going way, way back, talking about this idea of sons of God or revealers or prophets or enlightened ones, those who are sort of intermediary between a higher divine realm and humanity. Okay, all that's very important, I believe. Solomon's wisdom tradition, I mentioned these cities that were very influenced by it, like Alexandria, Damascus, Byzantium, which is a city or a region that we today call Constantinople or Istanbul. So this tradition, again, it went under the radar. I think people don't realize how important the Solomon's wisdom tradition is because it influenced Greece and Rome in profound ways and also influenced what we call knowledge and wisdom, the subjects that are in universities, the subjects that Aristotle expounded upon later, 500 years later, were little like hints in some of the Solomonic wisdom tradition, which basically says, the universe is ordered. It's ordered through divine law and through natural law. It's a very major concept. Okay, I think that slipped under the radar in terms of Western understanding. Then we come to Rabbinic Judaism between 100 and 600 CE in the Common Era. That's the time, when Jews were kicked out of Rome and the temple was destroyed, and they didn't disappear from the face of history as they probably, historical, reckoning would say they should have been. That should have completely annihilated the Jewish people because of the destruction of the temple and them being spread all over the world, the diaspora. But instead, they started to gather their scriptures together and comment on them and develop two Talmuds. Talmuds are commentaries on the Torah. Some people think it's all the same, Torah and Talmud. And in a broad universal definition of each of those, you could do that. But the Talmuds were large bodies of commentary on the Bible, one in Palestine and one in Babylon. Remember, the Jews had been exiled to Babylon, but then were freed by the Persian Zoroastrians, Cyrus the Great in particular. So the rabbinic tradition means commentary on the Bible with all of its implications for law and social custom and ritual. So the Talmud is a major piece of Jewish contributions to thinking about law through the ages. I summarized some of that, bottom of page 3. On page 4, I mentioned Maimonides. Maimonides was in the early medieval times, starting in Spain. And that's an amazing story that we touched on last session, because Spain, was led by Muslims between 750 and about 1250, 500 years. Jews, Christians, and Muslims thrived together. That's hard to believe. This has slipped under the radar too, that there was a time when Jews, Christians, and Muslims really learned from each other, appreciated each other, studied the same books. Maimonides came out of that tradition, and it was a great systematic thinker for Jews, but his systematic thinking influenced the way Christians thought and the way Muslims thought too. So, in other words, systematic thinking means you're trying to comment on the whole body of guidance and law that you get from Revelation and combine it with philosophy. Maimonides mastered Aristotle and Plato. So, systematic thinking caught on among Christians and Muslims, partly in response to Maimonides as an example of great systematic thinking. Okay, to me, systematic thinker is more than a philosopher. They're trying to sort of integrate all fields of knowledge under a big macro system. So Maimonides did that and included law in all his work. Okay, and I listed his 13 principles of the Jewish faith. That sort of inspired Muslims to say, what are the principles of Islam? And Christians, what are the principles of Christianity? If you're going to name those so precisely. And of course, there's overlap between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All right, now I'm jumping to the Greek context. In a sense, this is going backwards in time, because Maimonides was there in about the 11th century of the Common Era. But going back and looking at how Greece and Rome evolved, starting from about 1000 BCE, which is 3,000 years ago. And I mentioned highlights of Greek civilization. I only want a light on one of the things listed here, Solon's and Cleisthenes' Athenian democratic reform. So you might say those two gave us the first sort of well-developed version of democracy and of the need for something like a constitution that reflects democratic principles, balancing the powers of the poor and the rich. So that's an extremely important idea for how concepts developed around justice and law. Okay, so jump bottom of page 4, and I'm going to stop talking soon after another page and oh, but I have to tell you about Rome too, don't I? Well, we'll see. I'll stop at a certain point and see what you're thinking and want to ask or point out, and you may know parts of this better than me. We're touching so many areas. You're bound to have specialized in some of this. So Solon's code, I mentioned that at the bottom of page 4. This was in response to another code that came before that called Draco's code. You know, the word draconian kind of gives you shivers, right? A draconian code would say, here's some laws, and if you violate any one of them, you get put to death. So that's sort of summarizing a draconian code. Very, very strict, absolute. So Solon's code is a breath of fresh air in response to Draco's code, because it's way more flexible and lenient and starts to be sounding way more democratic. So I mentioned some of that at the bottom of page 4. He gets credit for shaping the early version of a constitution as we understand it in Western tradition, what that means. So that's like a written body that says, we intend to develop laws that look basically like this. Here are our major institutions for public decision making. On page 5, I mentioned Cleisthenes because he took it a step further, creating a council of 500. Wow, that's a big council. 500 people get to help decide what goes on in the Greek Empire. And of course, but a subset of those 500, maybe 50, would do the day-to-day administration. Okay, an executive committee that's smaller than the council. But this all starts to sound a little bit like modern consciousness about government and law. I should have mentioned Pericles here because, he was the ruler of Athens during 30 years, where you might say the Greek version of Greco-Roman civilization reached its apex. In the wake of that came Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and concepts that are foundational to the rest of Roman and Christian and to some extent Islamic understanding as well. I mentioned Plato and Aristotle on page 5. Two slightly different concepts of justice. In Plato's mind, justice is like a virtue of a society that you could say it's the cardinal virtue among the cardinal virtues. So virtue is something both individuals and states could replicate potentially. The other big virtues that are dealt with by Plato are self-control, or temperance, it's sometimes called, courage, and wisdom. But justice is given a special status. It's sort of like a meta virtue, and should show up in the state. Okay, so Plato's approach is more prescriptive, that the intelligentsia can tell people what justice is, prescribing it. And Aristotle's approach is a little different. He thinks of justice as something that emerges from the natural experience of human beings in building communities. So I say here Aristotle's justice as natural and constitutional order. And Aristotle liked to break things up into parts, like he talked about three types of rule: rule by one, rule by a few, and rule by many. So we tend to call these monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy today. So he spelled out these three types of constitutions. And he was trying to be objective and fair and say all of these can work under some circumstances. Justice can prevail under all three of these systems, but somehow history has sort of made Aristotle a defender more of democracy more than oligarchy and monarchy as well. But his main idea was there needs to be a constitution based on precedent and laws that work to benefit the city-state. Okay, I mentioned Alexander, who's called the Great in the West, and from a Persian point of view, he's called Alexander the Accursed because he conquered Persia for about 80 or 90 years. But the main reason to mention him here is that he had a vision of world empire, that there would be some sort of, so a world empire would need a law system and a justice system. And he came a couple of hundred years after Cyrus and Darius, and he admired them, even though they were rulers of the empire that he conquered. So the idea of a world empire with a world justice system was contributed to by Alexander. But again, he was kicking off of earlier versions of empire that were positive, I believe, that came to the world through Cyrus and Darius. Okay, now at the bottom of page 5 and going on to page 6, I mentioned Stoicism and cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is extremely important, and yet I don't know how many people think of that. Maybe you think of cosmopolitanism as like being sophisticated, able to live in a big city. That's cosmopolitanism. Philosophically, it's way more important than that, I believe. So cosmopolitanism is the idea that the center of a civilization should be a cosmopolis, that is a world city. A city into which everyone is welcome from all over the world. That so-called barbarians who don't live in the city would be welcome too. That everyone would have some kind of rights. So I'm just saying, I'm not saying this ever really happened, but Roman thinking, when at its highest mode, adopted a Stoic cosmopolitan point of view. Stoicism says basically there's something like natural law, and you have to adapt to those natural laws or else you'll be miserable. So, suck it up and adapt yourself to natural law. Cosmopolitanism applies that to the social order as well, saying there should be laws for the cosmopolis, the world city that directs traffic, so to speak, all around the world. And it also, there's another idea in cosmopolitanism that all the knowledge of the world belongs to everyone. So the cosmopolis should collect all the knowledge everywhere and teach it and bring about a global civilization. I'm interpreting, I see a lot in cosmopolitanism, and so I'm mentioning it as a part of the history of humanity's consciousness about a justice system. You know, I got to read one of these short paragraphs. Top of page 6, it says world citizen. See, world citizen comes from the idea of a cosmopolitan. A world citizen would be the cosmopolitan concept of the individual as endowed with a sense of global solidarity, identifying with humanity's history and the advancement of civilization. Today, this idea means commitment to eliminating prejudices of gender, class, race, nationality, culture, religion, and other beliefs, as well as active participation in community affairs, aiming toward an enduring world peace based on social justice. So I admit I'm interpreting, but I'm saying the seed of this kind of thinking was there in ancient cosmopolitan views, which got formulated about 300 BCE by a guy named Chrysippus. See, nobody knows his name. Even people that study philosophy, he slipped under the radar. But cosmopolitanism is an amazingly sophisticated view of justice and law for all of humanity. Okay. Then I mentioned Cicero, who was that great orator in ancient Rome, but he had a cosmopolitan point of view. So he was reminding of Rome of what it could be at its best. And it should be a republic. It should be a republic that has that listens to plebeians or the middle and lower classes. It should not only listen to aristocrats and to the ruler. Okay. Oh, I skipped over the 12 tables of Roman law. I shouldn't have done that. That's about 450 BCE. By that time, there was pressure to say, so Romans were law seems to be stacked in favor of the rich, who are called the patricians. So in response to that type of criticism, which was very profound, they started to develop these 12 tables of Roman law, which acknowledged the existence and the importance and the potential say of plebeians. So what we call a bicameral legislature, I think really got well developed in these 12 tables of law. So I mentioned that here. Yeah, Cicero was later and knew about the 12 tables and kept reminding people that's how we should be structured. So that implies that poor people can get educated and articulate their concerns and that they are heard by government. They can even serve in the government. That's the idea of having plebeians as a body of influence in a governmental system. I mentioned Augustus Caesar or Octavian, and he showed the Roman Empire pretty much at its best. So even though he was a ruler, he called himself princeps. He was trying to follow the guidance of Cicero and remind people of the cosmopolitan ideal. And he generated a reasonably peaceful era, Pax Romana, it's called. So, and he cared about law. He said law is vital. And so he found the best talent he could find in the empire to do some more codifying of the 12 tables that I mentioned earlier, refining that and applying it in a more cosmopolitan way. Again, I'm not saying that Roman emperors followed all this. Some of them were horrible. But in this course, we're emphasizing the high points right? The high points in the development of humanity's consciousness about law and justice. There's a lot of bad news in history. That's what made me not pay any attention to it for maybe 40 years of my life. And then I saw the light that there are good things in history, including religious civilizations at their best. And so what we're studying is what justice and law look like from the point of view of its high watermarks, its major contributions. We're taking an eagle eye view, you might say, of world history for this course. Okay, just one more thing at Papa page 7, then I shut up, and then we talk later about Christianity East and West. There was a guy named Ulpian about the year 220 CE of the Common Era, about 1800 years ago, whose legal commentaries were spectacular. So he put Roman law into its best form. And later on, Justinian, who we'll look at as an emperor of Eastern Christianity, improved upon what Ulpian did, integrating Christian concepts into the highest of Roman law. Okay, let me stop for a second. So in the last two sections, we'll look at, Western Christendom and Eastern Christendom. And most of us learned almost nothing about Eastern Christendom. I may be wrong, but that seems to me like here's what I learned about Eastern Christendom. It was bad. It broke away from Roman Catholicism and it went over to Russia and Greece and maybe Egypt, but it was not the real Christianity. That's what I learned. Oh my goodness. You have to look at it more carefully, see how influential it was. But anyway, let's not get to that. So far, any comments, questions, observations, appreciations, criticisms? Yeah, please, Bill.
Well, again, it's sort of overwhelming, and I really appreciate your commentary in looking at this outline and picking up these points. And there's so many ideas that occurred to me listening to you this morning. Just to mention one of them was this 10th commandment of
Oh,
Moses.
10th commandment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in a way that's you could think of that as a commandment to not being materialistic, or at least limiting your
That's how I
materialism.
see it, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's practically no discussion of the 10th commandment, I think, in the
That's a
larger society.
tragedy. Oh, so.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, very good observation. Yeah, there's a lot of gems. So this course is all about these gems, some of them noticed and some of them not noticed, that could be the basis of a broader concept of justice, a more just concept of justice, more appreciation for the religious roots of ideas of justice and law.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think people who are disillusioned with religion, I understand why they are, because enormous corruption is done under the name of religion. But it's important to realize, well, let's look at religion on its own terms before it got corrupted. That's what we're trying to do. There's some picked out a fantastic gem, that 10th commandment. I agree with
Yeah.
you. It opens up the whole moral spiritual realm. So it makes you think about law in a different way. So it's like a hint or coaching about spiritual and moral development and warning you about the danger of paying too much attention to material things. Right? Yeah, I think it's a critique of that, an early one.
Do you have a reference like to Noah's Code where you can look at
I'll tell
these
you
two
how to
issues?
find it. You Google Noah's Code,
Oh,
oral
okay.
tradition or something like that. Yeah, Noah's Code, Jewish oral tradition.
Okay.
That's where it's most well developed. or simply Noah's Code. I think it would take you right to it and tell you some of the sources. But generally, those sources are two general sources: Jewish oral tradition, and get this, Islamic oral tradition.
Uh,
That interesting.
So in other words, Muhammad was asked about that too, because it was briefly mentioned in the Quran. And then, what do you mean by that? Okay, some more came out there. So, what we call the Bible or scripture is what gets written. And then there's a lot of oral discussion about that evolves over the eons. Then, the Talmud, those are basically oral traditions that got written down.
yeah.
Okay.
Once they're written down, they're not called oral anymore, but that's where they came from. So, but some people, they say I have less respect for its oral tradition. I have more respect for the written. I think it's not that simple. The oral tradition also tells you how the written tradition was interpreted, what it meant, maybe its limitations, maybe where it needs to be expanded. So, yeah, so Muslims, for example, might say, well, we have the Quran, we don't need the Hadith. Yes, you do need the Hadith. The Hadith is like 6 to 8 volumes of commentary on the Quran, without which you couldn't develop Islamic law, right? And you wouldn't have a deeper understanding of what Muhammad meant in certain lines in the Quran. So I see oral tradition as is important. It's good to get a sense of the consensus in oral tradition about what's written. But yeah, I'm carried away. So those 7 things are not in the Bible in the Genesis story. Yet they were known to the sort of the leader, so to speak, in Jewish tradition. Yeah. All right. In terms of Christianity, the oral traditions as well. Those were
Yeah.
other gospels, some of them later written down, some of them not. Or somebody remembering what was spoken about. Anyway, they're another part of the story. Okay, any other gems that hit anyone about anything said or complaints or there's always
Baxter and
danger of
Nevaeh
stepping
both
on.
have their hands up.
Oh, good. Hands are up. Baxter, I see your hand up. Okay, good.
Thank you, Harold. Is there any commentary or writings anywhere about the influence of Salih and Hood? Or are they
Ah,
completely lost to
he's
history?
referring to 2 prophets that are mentioned by Baha'u'llah. And I think they show up in the Quran, but again, not much at all. So again, that's all I could say is Google those 2 figures and look for both uh, scriptural references and oral traditions around them. Yeah. But no one even knows when they were. I'm thinking they must have been about 2800 BCE. Anyway, yeah, that's the best I can do on that stuff. Okay, Tani, Nivi. Yeah.
Yeah, well, about Saleh, I wondered if he might be mentioned in those the Law of Moses that you said the first 5 books refer to past prophets. Could it be in there?
I didn't see him there, but here's a funny catch-all. The Sabaeans are mentioned in the books of Moses. And that's been a big question. Who are those Sabaeans? And they're called wise men and such. But from the Baha'i, in Islam and the Baha'i faith, the Sabaeans are mentioned again as monotheists. See, I think, for example, there are hints of the Sabaeans in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where it mentions, you remember I don't know if you know about Melchizedek,
Melzijah?
but there are great figures who, wow, they're impressive. And so I think there are hints. Sabaeans, and people argue about where did they go. Some say south in what we would call Yemen. Some say they went across over into Egypt and Ethiopia. Sabaeans, and maybe Salih and the figures that Baxter was talking about, might have been in a similar tradition. They were prophets too, capital P, but we know, here's another, we're getting really far afield. Dead Sea Scrolls, you've heard of those, right? They seem to be, faint echoes of the Sabaean tradition. Sabaeans were people who basically were monotheists, but they were willing to learn from later teaching, right? So they absorbed it. Anyway, I think that Sabaeans someday, when we learn more about them and discover more Dead Sea Scrolls or something, will be like a missing piece of the puzzle. Another monotheistic tradition that was willing to learn from other monotheistic traditions under the faint assumption that's the same God is behind all of those other traditions.
So
Yeah, yeah.
the other part of my question, Harold, was about Noah's Code, and you mentioned that that one of the 7 codes was to ensure justice. I looked it up and it said ensure justice, but I thought I heard you say to establish justice courts.
Yeah, well, again, that's oral tradition. I saw different
Okay,
wording and I just I
so
summed it up my way.
yeah, so like I was wondering, how did they ensure it? Because what came after um in Moses' time were pretty harsh punishments to discipline people and prevent them, like negative reinforcement to prevent them from doing wrong things. And so I wondered, in Noah's time, was it as harsh? How did they ensure justice?
That's so far back and the courses are so sketchy. I can't really answer. I just have a sense about it that the courts, that's a later word used. So it means an official way of making decisions about breaches of law. How do you do that? So there's some kind of a court. It could be one person. It could be a body of wise figures who know about the tradition. In the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha said, have industrial courts to resolve issues about labor and management. So a court is an official way of making a decision about what's right and wrong. I assume there was something very primitive version of that way back that Noah was referring to. You need a way to figure out what divine guidance is and how that applies to human beings here on earth in particular. So that's the word court, which can mean a lot of different things, but I assume it was utterly simple way back then. Yeah. Okay, maybe someday we're going to discover. I blame Alexander for this. When he burned all those books in Persia, that was very bad. There might have been illumination about all these things because the Persians were absorbing knowledge from all over the world. They might have been able to tell us more about Noah's code, right? And what courts used to mean, what they became later. You see, language is limited. So English has a lot of words, which is one of its strengths. And so in English, that's how we interpret some of what Noah seemed to be referring to. Figure out how to make decisions about right and wrong. That's establish courts, establish rulers of that type. Okay, that's all I can do. Sorry. I wish we knew more. I blame Alexander. Stone books. That's bad.
Yeah.
Baxter, your hand is still up.
I'm sorry, I'm up again. I'm sorry to
That's
be
all right.
so frequent here. Harold, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this question of the ultimate purpose of law. Why does God give us laws? I mean, humanity, the animal, has an instinct for fairness, an instinct to collect into a community or a group of people will collect in a cave. And if I've got something to eat, I'll just kind of generally share it with whoever's in the cave with me. That's a system of justice that is just essential to the beast, is how I'm thinking of it. And so there's certain laws that are just essential to the beast. What do these divine laws give us that we wouldn't have if we just were faithful to essential concepts or essential drives towards justice? I hope I'm
That's a
I hope I'm
blockbuster
articulating my
question. This
question.
is that question is so much better than any possible answer I could give you. So hold on. That question this is about. Here's a broad generalization. It looks to me like humanity is given guidance, and you could break it up into two very big pieces. Guidance about ultimate reality, way up there, whatever that is, and guidance also about how to live down here on earth. Two kinds of guidance. And you could say, this is what why I like the Stoics. They talked about natural law as something built into the nature of things. Whether you say they almost have the word order instead of God, or nature instead of God. And at the ultimate level, but now more practical, we need a procedure for ways of doing things down here. So this is the way the human animal, so to speak, or we have consciousness and some kind of reasoning, and we see that things could be done in different ways. So we need guidance about which way, so that we don't always fight about it, so that there's some sort of social order. So I guess what I'm saying is it looks like there's cosmic ordering processes and then social ordering processes. And these prophets or revealers that have been given to humanity down through the ages give us insight about that. They give us increasingly sophisticated lessons. And then after we get the lesson, then we human beings, ordinary people, ponder that and develop it further, right? And sift and sort among it. I think a short answer to your question is we need laws because we have consciousness. If we didn't have any consciousness, it would all be instinct, wouldn't it? But we have consciousness, so we need guidance and direction to help us sort through. And also conditions down here on the earth change, and they vary from region to region. Oh, that adds more complication to the rules, or what we mean by justice. Okay, anyway, so no, that question is humongously important. And I'm just sort of groping around, trying to point to ways it might be approached. Nivi again, please, or rather, Tani, or however you want to be called.
I was just going to say that but perhaps it's when people may have instincts to help those that they care about or get along with. But as soon as there's a conflict, and it's easy to reject that person and not give them their due, even if they have just cause. Or when we start, you mentioned regions, when we start mixing with different tribes, different families, people who are different from us, but they have something to contribute to society. So they are different. They do something that you don't like, then you have a conflict, and then it's important to have a law that is good for all, so it isn't dependent on just your instinct to like or not like somebody, and naturally, be helpful towards them. So maybe it's when we started, branching from families to tribes to, nations, that we needed to have something that more formal. But
That seems like a wonderful point. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah,
I've
well,
got
I
to
just wondered, I was just wondering, like The Jews saw themselves as the chosen people, and they had this divine code, the background of the divine, what did you call it? Divine
Covenant
divine law.
law. Yeah.
But um, but to me, if they thought they had this gift from God, then for me, it's very important how they establish that law. If it's divine, to me, it should not be uh, taught through force or conquest, but through illumination, through argument, through proofs, through demonstration of how it leads to virtue. But there's a history of, force and killing and war, and it's
Nivy, I
and
got to
it's
comment, and then I got to bump us to the rest of there's last 3 more pages here. But see, that's why you have to add Solomon's wisdom tradition. I think that's a tradition of persuasion, reasonable persuasion, right? So yeah, what do you do with the law? You could impose it in draconian fashion, right? But I think there's plenty of room in scripture, and especially if you add Christian scripture to this discussion, for persuasion, reasonable persuasion, appealing to this conscience that we have and this reasonable capacity that we have. Okay, I gotta jump. You see, Tani, you mentioned this bit about to all people. Oh, that word all. I have to jump from that. So look at Western Christian concepts. I mentioned Jesus trying to simplify Jewish law. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He said, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. This is sort of like separating moral spiritual law a little bit from civic law, right? And you have figures like at the bottom of page 7, I mentioned Peter and Paul. The little tilt they gave things is very important, I think. So Peter taught God shows no partiality. Ooh, no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. This is sort of saying, the implications that are staggering. So it's like saying, the same God can be observed elsewhere in another country. Anyone who does what is right is acceptable to him. Another one, Paul, God made from one blood every nation. We all came from one blood. All the other nations or peoples came out of that. What else? Let each of you, Paul says, look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So the norms of respect, intercultural, interreligious respect, international respect, and impartiality, like divine law applying to everyone, whether they're Christian or not. That's what I throw that in there. You have a universal outlook that's part of Christian message. Now, I admit, if you study all scriptural traditions, you can find things that looked exclusive, like they're saying, this is a very important tradition. This is the one you should pay attention to, and inclusive or universal. You have both dimensions in every faith, Baha'i faith, Islamic faith, Christian faith, Jewish faith. So, but we're talking mostly about the universal ones, the inclusive. That's what we're collecting, because that has implications for universal law or global justice, right? And I'm saying, yeah, there's plenty of that in Christian tradition, right in the scripture. Let me go on. I want to look at the top of page 8. Constantine is to Christianity what Ashoka was to Buddhism. In other words, a ruler who gets converted and says, you know what? This is a really good religion, and we're going to build a whole new society, allow a new society to be built on it. So Constantine's Edict of Toleration in 313 is extremely important. It's saying Christianity is no longer illegal in the Roman Empire. We're not going to persecute Christians. In fact, we might even let them build a church. We might even use state money for that. Christians like to take care of orphans. Well, we might help them do that too. There might be social projects done under the Christian banner, and the state should support it. So anyway, that has enormous implications. Constantine allowing Christian, so I would say in Christian evolution, it went from a birth phase to a growth phase. It was able to start growing institutionally because of Constantine's edict in 313. You got a specific date there. Okay. I put down Augustine, St. Augustine, great thinker, who wrote The City of God, that had implications for how we think about justice. There's a city of God and there's a city of man. We want the city of man to look more like the city of God. What are these things, pray tell? So he had 800 pages worth of commentary on the city of God and the city of man, using the best he could wean from Christian guidance as well as Greco-Roman. He was a smart guy, and Christianity has a lot of Greece and Rome in it. That's why we have this course structured the way we're doing it. See, there's layers. You know, Jewish, Greco-Roman, Christian, and then two varieties of Christian are foundational to what we call Western thinking, the Western worldview about law and justice. I mentioned Pope Gregory the Great in the middle of page 8. He established the temporal power of papacy. So this was extremely important for better and for worse. You know, there are some good things about this and maybe not so good things about this. My last paragraph on Gregory here, middle of page 8. In addition to much missionary expansion, Gregory was revered for his literary and artistic contributions, biblical commentaries, powerful homilies, dialogues on classical philosophical themes, numerous letters, liturgical innovations, including the famous Gregorian chant. You heard of Gregorian chants and forgot that that went back to Gregory. Through him, the papacy became the supreme authority of the Western Church, as well as a potent temporal leader. See that word temporal? So it's religion combined with civic power. So Gregory is sort of an important figure in that development. Now, I turn to the Eastern Christian Church, which, you know, we have Eurocentric prejudices against it. I'm going to read that whole section there called Some Highlights of Eastern Christian Civilization, because this might be new to you. Who else can I bug to read? Anyone willing to read? No one's willing to read. Okay, I'll read. It says, this is near the bottom of page 8, Highlights of Eastern Christian Civilization. Constantinople's synthesis of Roman law and state organization, integrating Hellenic, that means Greco-Roman, thought and culture, the vitality and unifying power of a cosmopolitan center of the Eastern Christian world in Constantinople, preservation of Greek literature and philosophy, a vast regional trading network, including Europe, Asia Minor, the Near Middle East, and North Africa. Impressive architectural construction techniques, majestic vaults and domes, vibrant mosaics, a highly functional utility system, flourishing monasteries and missionary work spreading the Christian faith peacefully, providing the major civilizing force for Egypt and other parts of the Near East, and it went into Russia too. So this Eastern Christian Church went into all of Russia, which is a very big piece of real estate. Okay, we shouldn't forget all that. From the 9th century onward, it's civilized, Eastern Christendom civilized the Balkans and Russia, especially through the Cyrillic alphabet. There was a guy named Cyril who taught Russia how to read and write and read the Bible, leading to Moscow as the third Rome. Third Rome. The first Rome was Rome. The second Rome was Constantinople. And the third Rome, Moscow. Moscow. At least that's how the Eastern Christian Church thinks of this. It became a center of Christian civilization. Okay, those are highlights of Eastern Christendom that you didn't hear about in public school, probably, and are important to know. Then I mentioned this guy named Justinian. Justinian is a toweringly important figure in Christian history, and yet he's considered less important than Constantine. Constantine moved, he moved Rome over to Constantinople. He said, we need another center. This empire is too big. Let's have two capitals. So he moved over to he picked that place because of its location between the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Wow, that's a strategic location. And it built up, and Justinian was emperor of it. And he decided to develop a code taking the best of Greco-Roman law through Ulpian and combining it with Christian principles, from Jesus, Paul, and Peter. And he got about 50 scholars working on this and came up with 50 volumes called the Justinian Code, Christianized Roman law. That became the model for law in many other parts of the world. Napoleon, took that, the Justinian Code, 1,300 years later, and tried to secularize it, like remove religion from it. So these are two very big moves in the history of law and justice. Okay, and I have to tell you about Vladimir of Kiev. He was a guy. This is in the year about 990. He says, religion is a good idea. It's a way of unifying people. So we need a religion for Kiev. And so he actually thought about which religion is it going to be? There's something called Christianity, and it seems to have two pieces, the Western version and the Eastern version. And there's something called Buddhism, and there's something called Judaism. Jews had already, through the diaspora, got over to Russia. So he's thinking, what religion am I going to build my little empire around? And he ended up deciding on Eastern Christendom because one of his court magistrates went to Constantinople and saw the Hagia Sophia built by Justinian, and it was the most beautiful building in the world at that time. Well, I shouldn't say that, in the West, right? And so he came back with the impression that Eastern Christendom really emphasizes beauty, the creation of beauty, the beauty of creation, and God's sense that we should build beautiful structures. And so Vladimir of Kiev said, guess what? We're going to be Eastern Orthodox. That's going to be the religion. And of course, that spread through all of what we call Russia. Beauty is a big piece of this. You might say it's a more mystical version of Christianity. Well, look for beauty, appreciate beauty, contribute to beauty. That's why they went into this icon controversy. Everybody was beautifying sanctuaries, with mosaics. And they said they were making things so beautiful that people are worshiping statues in the church. But and then eventually they decided, yes, it's okay. It's okay to have these icons because they point us to the saints. They point us to Jesus. They point us to Mary. They're not identical to them. They lift us up. So beauty became part of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And it's all because of Vladimir of Kiev. You know, he considered alternatives and made a decision. I mentioned a few more things like Charlemagne. The closest thing to a European emperor we ever had was called the First Holy Roman Emperor. The important thing I want to bring up is that these good rulers, I'm not saying Charlemagne was perfect, but he did have a sense of let's gather the knowledge of the world and let's build a society based on it. And let's incorporate a lot of different tribes, you know, Germanic tribes, Franco tribes. There were British tribes, lots of tribes in Europe. You know, we now think of them as nations, but they were once tribal groups. The closest to ever organizing all of Europe was under Charlemagne. Something called the Carolingian Renaissance emerged. Once you have a ruler who says knowledge is important, beauty is important, integrating various cultural traditions is important, some good things happen. All right. And then last little bit here, Gratian's law, canon law. He what we call just war theory. He started to spell that out. What is a just law, a just war? And he mentioned, I'm listing things that has to have a just cause, right authorities, right intentions, proportional use of force, done as a last resort. It must have the purpose of peace, and a reasonable hope of success. So this is a Christian thinker who, you know, looked at scriptures and saw, yes, sometimes you do have to use force, but under what conditions? This ended up having a lot of implications for the development of international law. I mentioned Aquinas and Erasmus at the very end there, two thinkers that had a lot, Aquinas especially, because he, like the cosmopolites or the cosmopolitans, noticed that there's natural law and divine law, and that they're intricately related. The same God set them both up, right? Divine law and natural law. And because Aquinas made this incredible synthesis, 21 volumes of systematic theology and ethics, had a lot to do with how the West thinks about what is a justice system. How it goes back to that question that I think Baxter was asking about, which I break up into the two pieces, divine law and human law, right? And how are they related? Aquinas really thought a lot about that. And Erasmus noticed that there were a lot of religiously inspired wars, Christian, so-called Christian nations, you know, in military conflict. So this book called Complaint of Peace had a lot of wisdom about that led to the realization we need international law, not just law of one religious civilization or one region or one nation, but something like international law. And that's what we're going to look at next week. Next session, 2 weeks from now. Okay. All right, friends, comments, questions, complaints, observations. I hope I've done justice to this big thing called Christianity and some of the high points that we might have missed because of our education. You know, I didn't even tell you about a guy named Photius the Great. There was no room. There was a great thinker around 860 in the Eastern world who he had so many books that his house became a meeting place for civic and religious leaders in Constantinople. His house evolved into the University of Constantinople. But he was a brilliant thinker and was the ecumenical patriarch for about 20 years in Constantinople. So this thing called the Byzantine Renaissance, he's the key figure in the generation of the Byzantine Renaissance. In other words, Eastern Christianity at its best got inspired by Photius the Great, who I had never heard of I got angry. Why didn't they tell me about Photius the Great when I was studying Christianity? That name, Photius, means light bearer. But you never hear about Photius the Great. Well, you learn only about the Western Church and then Protestantism. What happened to Eastern Christendom? It civilized a large part of the world, right? And there were some major achievements having to do with justice and law. We need the Eastern Christendom part of the story to understand the development of modern understanding of justice and law. Sorry for preaching so much, but I'm telling you, did you guys know about Eastern Christianity very much? Had you heard about it? Mainly you learned that there was a schism. That's probably what you heard. They broke away. How dare they break away from the Western Church? They had good reasons. And they added some things. Okay. Anything else? Oh, I didn't mention the Magna Carta, but we're picking up on that next time. The Magna Carta. You know, Westerners think the Magna Carta was the first statement of that sovereigns should follow the law. But in this course, you might remember India said that 1,500 years before, and China said that, and Persia said that. I'm not saying they followed it very perfectly, but the Magna Carta was late on the scene regarding, sovereigns having to follow the law. And it was kicking and screaming. King John was forced to sign that. He didn't want to. The barons made him do it, threatening war if he didn't.
Harold, Roz, and Baxter both have their hands up.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Roz, where are you? Roz, yeah. And then Baxter.
I'm here. The history that we're talking about is wonderful. It is progressive, and I really value your knowledge and your presentation. But I also am trying to integrate the idea of the beginning and the end, the first and the last, and the circle of unity, which is some ancient and some modern thought. It's there, that concept of we're all related and it's a circle rather than a line that progresses, which is how we look at history. So that's just my thought. There may be a question in there, but I just wanted to sort of put that out there.
You know, Roz, I discovered the same thing. When I wrote this book here, Eye to the Ages, I noticed that cyclical thinking is in the Western mind associated with East. In other words, India and China think cyclically. In the West, we think progressive and linearly. You know what I found out when I looked carefully? That you find both linear and cyclical thinking in both East and West. In other words, the whole story, of course, there are patterns. There are seasons of the year, spring, summer, fall, winter, and then there's another spring. But is that spring exactly the same spring as a year ago? Maybe there was progress in between. So cyclical and linear, the way you reconcile them, I think, is to think of a spiral. There are patterns that go back and forth, but they're at a higher level or maybe a lower level. Maybe there's digression or maybe there's progression. But the deepest thinking I could find in East and West acknowledge both elements. There are cyclical patterns, a big circle, as you say, to unite everyone. And there's also a sense of progress or linear development. Anyway, that's a very important question. Comment. Yeah, Baxter, and then we got to go. We're running out of time here. Yeah,
Harold, sorry to keep coming back. I was just have a question. Who were the Coptics? Or is that just another word for Eastern Christianity? The Coptic Christians?
Well, they're Egyptian Christians. And yes, this was more, if we throw away Eastern Christianity, we have to throw away Coptics and the Christians that were in Ethiopia that generated a very powerful society very literate society. It went into Eastern Europe, Greece, all of Russia, right? Yeah. So Coptics, I think that's the Egyptian version of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, a very early version of it. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. You're very tolerant. I hope I didn't give you too big of a headache. We're going to look at the history of international law starting next week, 2 weeks from now, with Magna Carta, and jump to the 1600s. And it'll be a way more modern sounding, what we're looking at 2 weeks from now. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.